It was the summer of 1985 when my family and I decided to take a trip to Shadow Lake National Park in Montana. A break from the noise, the traffic, and the television. Just us and nature. That's all we wanted. My name is Mark Thompson, and at 42 years old, I had spent most of my life inside classrooms, teaching history to high school kids who barely listened. I needed this trip. My wife, Lisa, 39, our daughters, Emma, 10, and Claire, 13, and Lisa's parents, Harold, 66, and Betty, 64, had been looking forward to it for weeks. Harold and Betty were getting older, and we figured this might be one of the last trips we could all take together as a family. We packed the station wagon before dawn, stuffing it with tents, sleeping bags, fishing gear, coolers full of food, and enough marshmallows to rot the girls' teeth. The drive was long but beautiful. Montana stretched out before us. Endless trees, rolling hills, and skies so wide they made you feel small. As we got deeper into the park, the paved roads turned to dirt, and the sound of gravel crunching under our tires replaced the hum of the highway. By mid-afternoon, we arrived at Pine Creek, a secluded area nestled between towering pines, far from the designated campgrounds. No tourists, no noisy neighbors, just the wind in the trees and the steady murmur of the creek. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Harold said, stretching his back. "That's the best part," I replied, already feeling the weight of the real world slipping away. We spent the next few hours setting up camp. The girls helped pitch the tents while Lisa and Betty organized the food. Harold and I worked on a fire pit, stacking rocks and clearing away brush. By the time the sun started to set, the site felt like home. That night, we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, the laughter of my daughters mixed with the crackling of the fire, blending into the vastness of the forest. I slept like a baby. The next evening, as we sat by the fire, he appeared. At first, I thought it was an animal, a rustling in the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. Then a figure stepped out from the shadows. He was in his mid-30s, tall but gaunt, with greasy black hair and hollowed-out cheeks. His clothes were filthy, ripped jeans, a stained flannel shirt, boots caked with mud. But it was his eyes that unsettled me. They weren't wild, like a drifter high on something. They were calm, calculating, watching. "Evening, folks," he said, nodding. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. The firelight flickered across his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. "Evening," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "Just passing through," he continued. "Mind if I warm up by the fire?" I hesitated. Lisa shifted uncomfortably beside me. The girls had stopped roasting marshmallows, staring at the man like he was something pulled from one of their ghost stories. Before I could say no, Harold, ever the kind old man, spoke up. "Sure, son. Pull up a seat." The stranger smiled. Too wide, too forced, and crouched by the fire. "Name's Daniel," he said. I introduced us, watching his reaction as I listed my family members. His eyes lingered on Lisa and the girls just a little too long. For the next half hour, he mostly listened. Occasionally he asked questions. Where we were from, how long we were staying, whether we'd been here before. They were normal enough questions, but something about the way he asked them made my skin crawl. Like he wasn't making conversation, he was gathering information. Eventually he stood. "Well, I better get going," he said. "Maybe I'll see you folks around." Then he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just a heavy silence pressing down on our campsite. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling something just beyond my vision. A presence. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tents. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers tightening around it like a lifeline. Holding my breath, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. In the dying glow of the fire, I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading around our tents. I wanted to wake Lisa, but I didn't. Aim. Instead, I lay back down, gripping the flashlight, and waited for morning. 2 days passed without incident. I started convincing myself I'd overreacted, that the footprints had been ours, that Daniel was just a drifter looking for a warm place to sit. Then, on the third evening, he came back. "Hey," Daniel said, stepping into our camp like he belonged there. "My car broke down a little ways back. Think you could give me a hand?" Every instinct in my body screamed no. But before I could speak, Harold, always the good Samaritan, nodded. "Of course. Mark and I can help." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said, "lead the way." We followed him into the woods. The further we walked, the denser the trees became. The light from our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. "How much farther?" Harold asked. "Just up ahead," Daniel said. Then he stopped, turned, and pulled a gun from his pocket. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Everything slowed. Harold's eyes widened. He lifted his hands. "Listen, son." The gunshot was deafening. Harold crumpled to the ground. I didn't think. I lunged. My shoulder slammed into Daniel's chest. The gun flew from his hand. We struggled, rolling in the dirt, until I managed to shove him away. Then I ran. Branches whipped against my face. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I don't remember how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled onto a dirt road. Headlights. A truck. I ran into the middle of the road, waving frantically. The truck screeched to a stop and a man jumped out. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I could barely breathe. "My family." By the time authorities reached the campsite, it was too late. Lisa, Emma, Claire, Betty, gone. Daniel had killed them and vanished. It took 6 months to find him. When they did, he confessed. He had been watching us since the first night, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my window. I used to think nightmares ended when you woke up, that after the terror passed, you could open your eyes, take a deep breath, and remind yourself it was all just a bad dream. But some nightmares stay with you, lurking in the shadows of your mind, whispering in the quiet moments of your life, waiting to remind you that the horror was real. My name is Mark Thompson, and I haven't slept soundly since the summer of 1985. Not since my wife, my daughters, and my in-laws were murdered in the woods. Not since a man named Daniel walked out of the darkness and into our campsite, smiling like he belonged there. Some nights I still hear the footsteps circling my tent. Some nights I wake up gasping for breath, expecting to see those cold, empty eyes staring at me through the trees. But time moves on, even when you don't want it to. People forget. They go back to their lives, back to work, back to school. They pack up their tents and sleeping bags. They head into the woods, laughing, drinking, telling stories by the fire. They don't know what waits for them out there, or maybe they just don't want to know. It was the summer of 2001 when a group of college friends decided to take a camping trip into Redwood Valley. 5 of them. Jake, Aaron, Michelle, Brittany, and Nina. Young, carefree, looking for a weekend of drinking and adventure under the stars. They picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the tourist trails, where no one would bother them, a place where no one would hear the screams. Lindsay arrived late that afternoon, grinning as she stepped out of her car, tossing her backpack over one shoulder. "You guys are assholes for making me drive out here alone," she joked, laughing as she popped open a beer and took a long sip. Michelle smiled back, too sweet, too practiced. "Come on, we just wanted to make sure you actually showed up." Lindsay didn't notice the glance Michelle exchanged with Brittany. She didn't see the way Aaron and Jake smirked behind their beers, but Nina did. She saw the way the air shifted when Lindsay arrived, the way the jokes turned sharper, the way Michelle's voice lost its warmth. At first it was subtle, a casual dig here, a pointed question there. "So, Lindsay," Michelle said as they sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey between them, "whatever happened with that guy you were seeing, the one who ghosted you?" Lindsay's smile faltered. I don't know. It didn't work out, I guess." Brittany snorted. "Didn't work out, or he just figured out what you're really like?" The laughter that followed was cruel, hollow. Lindsay forced a laugh of her own, but Nina could see the way her fingers tightened around her drink. By the time the second bottle of whiskey was empty, the insults weren't jokes anymore. They were accusations, old grudges dragged into the light of the fire. "You know what your problem is, Lindsay?" Aaron said, leaning forward, his voice slurring. "You never own up to anything, you just play the victim." Lindsay frowned, glancing at Nina, but Nina looked away. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell them all to stop, but the words wouldn't come. "Okay," Lindsay said finally, pushing herself to her feet. "I think I'm gonna head out." Jake was faster. He stood, blocking her path, grinning. "Not yet," he said. The air turned heavy. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night. Lindsay looked from Jake to Aaron, to Michelle and Brittany, but none of them moved. Her voice wavered. "Guys, this isn't funny." Michelle pulled a roll of duct tape from her bag. Lindsay's scream echoed through the trees. They forced her back to the ground, laughing as they taped her wrists, as they pressed the bottle to her lips, forcing her to drink. She choked, gasped, struggled, but they didn't stop. "You wanted to be part of the group, right?" Tim said, his grip tightening. Nina couldn't move. She sat frozen by the fire, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. It was a joke. It had to be a joke. They weren't actually going to hurt her. They were just messing around, just having fun. Then Michelle pulled out the knife. A small hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the firelight. "Relax," she murmured, running the tip along Lindsay's arm, drawing a thin line of red. "It's just a game," Lindsay sobbed. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, stop." But they didn't stop. Somewhere between the screaming and the laughter, the kicking and the struggling, the game turned into something else, something real. The knife slipped. The blood came faster. Lindsay gasped, shuddered, then fell still. Silence. A moment of shock, of realization, of horror. Aaron stumbled backward. "Oh shit," he whispered. "Oh shit, oh shit." Jake dropped the bottle, his hands shaking. Michelle stared at the knife in her hands, at the blood on her fingers, as if she didn't understand how it got there. "We have to get rid of her," she said, her voice eerily calm. Brittany nodded. "We'll bury her," she said. "No one will ever find her." Nina ran. She didn't think, didn't look back. She sprinted through the woods, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning, her mind screaming at her to keep going, to keep running. The trees blurred past her, the darkness pressing in. She could hear them shouting behind her, hear Michelle screaming her name, but she didn't stop. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A light, a cabin. She slammed into the door, pounding with both fists. "Help," she sobbed. "Please, help me." The door swung open. A man stood there, middle-aged, eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "What happened to you?" The police arrived within the hour. By the time they reached the campsite, Jake, Aaron, Michelle and Brittany were trying to bury Lindsay's body beneath a pile of leaves and dirt. They were arrested on the spot. Michelle was sentenced to life without parole. Aaron and Jake got 25 years each, Brittany 20. Nina, who never lifted a hand against Lindsay but never did anything to stop it, was sentenced to 5 years for being an accessory to murder. She testified against them all. She stood in front of the court and told them what happened, how it started as a joke, how it spiraled into something else, something dark. She told them about Lindsay's screams, about the way the blood looked in the firelight, and then she told them the truth, that no matter how many years passed, no matter how much time she spent behind bars, she would never stop hearing those screams, that some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Some nightmares stay with you forever. There's something about the woods that lures people in. Maybe it's the quiet, the solitude, the promise of escape from the real world, or maybe it's something else, something darker. People go missing in the wilderness all the time. Sometimes they're found, sometimes they never are, and sometimes what's found isn't enough to explain what really happened. I've spent years trying to forget the things I've seen, the stories I've heard, the family murdered at Shadow Lake, the girl who never made it out of Redwood Valley. But the woods don't forget. The things that happen out there stay, lingering in the roots, in the trees, in the air itself, and sometimes They come back. Ethan and his friends just wanted a break. No cell phones, no deadlines, no crowded city streets, just nature. 6 of them, Ethan, Caleb, Sarah, Vanessa, Jordan and Dylan, piled into 2 SUVs and drove out to Black Hollow Forest, Washington, a place no one had ever heard of, far from the tourist trails. The perfect place to disappear for a few days. The first 2 nights were exactly what they hoped for. Campfires, beers, old stories, laughter that carried through the trees. The forest was dense, ancient, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. There were no other campers, no signs of civilization, just them and the trees. On the 3rd night, he arrived. They were sitting around the fire when they heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, just beyond the firelight. At first, they thought it was an animal. Then a man stepped into view. He was old, maybe late 60s, with a scruffy grey beard and eyes that looked too sharp for his age. His clothes were dirty, his boots worn down to the soles. He smiled at them, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that sent a shiver up Ethan's spine. "Evening," the man said. "Didn't think I'd see folks out here." Caleb was the first to speak. "Didn't think there was anyone else out here." The old man chuckled, stepping closer to the fire, his face flickering in the glow. "Most folks stay away from these parts," he said. "Too much history." His gaze moved over them, counting, measuring. "What kind of history?" Sarah asked, shifting uncomfortably. The old man crouched near the fire, his hands stretched toward the warmth. "Ever hear about the campers back in '82? They shook their heads. "Family came out here, just like you. Husband, wife, 2 little girls, grandparents. One night they disappeared. Weeks later they found their van, burned to nothing. The bodies were inside." He paused, staring into the fire. "Except one. The father. He made it out. Ran for miles until he found a road. But by then, it was too late." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Vanessa shifted in her seat. "That's awful," she murmured. The old man nodded. "The woods have a way of keeping things. Sometimes, they don't let go." He stood abruptly, dusting off his hands. "Well, I should be moving on. Appreciate the fire." Without another word, he turned and walked into the trees. No flashlight, no hesitation. He disappeared like he had never been there at all. The group sat in uneasy silence. "That was creepy as hell," Vanessa muttered. "Just some old guy trying to scare us," Jordan said. But even he didn't sound convinced. Ethan forced a laugh. "Yeah, probably just messing with us." But the forest felt different after that. Darker. Heavier. The air seemed to press against their skin, thick with something unseen. They tried to shake it off, but that night Ethan couldn't sleep. Somewhere past midnight he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the tent. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again on the other side of the campsite. His heart pounded. He reached out, shaking Caleb's shoulder. "Dude, wake up!" Caleb groaned, half asleep. "What?" "Listen." Caleb froze, his breathing suddenly sharp. The footsteps stopped. Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched so thin, it felt like something was pressing against the fabric of the tent. Then a shadow passed in front of the fire. Someone was out there. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound was gone. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind whispering through the trees. The next morning, Dylan was missing. At first, they thought he had gone to relieve himself. But an hour passed, then another. His stuff was still there, his phone, his shoes, his jacket. But he was gone. They shouted his name, scoured the area, checked the creek, but there was nothing. No footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle. It was like he had been lifted out of existence. Panic set in. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Now!" "We can't just leave him," Caleb argued. "We have to find him." "He's gone," Vanessa snapped, her face pale. "You don't just disappear like that. Something's wrong." They grabbed their gear, shoving it into their packs, moving fast. The hike back felt endless. The trees pressed in on them, the silence almost unbearable. Every snapping twig made them flinch. Every shadow looked like it was watching. By the time they reached their cars and called the police, Dylan had been missing for over 6 hours. The search lasted for weeks. Authorities scoured the area. They found nothing. No sign of him, no tracks, no clues. Until 2 weeks later, when they found his body, a mile from their campsite, deep in a cave, Dylan's remains were discovered. His clothes were torn, his body bruised, broken. He had been alive for days, and then he wasn't. They never determined exactly how he died, but they found something else, a hidden campsite, and inside it Dylan's belongings. His watch, his backpack, his wallet, as if someone had been keeping them. The police tried to track down the old man they had met that night, but there was no trace of him. No records, no report of anyone matching his description. To this day, they never found him. Ethan doesn't go camping anymore. None of them do. Sometimes when he lies awake at night, he thinks about that man, about the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, about the way he vanished into the trees, and sometimes, just before sleep takes him, he wonders, is he still out there, watching, waiting, or is he already somewhere else, closer than we think? The woods have always been a place of mystery, a place where people seek peace, solitude, and adventure. But as these stories have shown, the wilderness is also unpredictable, and sometimes it hides things far more terrifying than wild animals or bad weather. It hides people, people with dark intentions, people who watch, who wait, who strike when you least expect it. If there's one lesson to take away from these stories, it's this: never let your guard down. For Mark Thompson and his family, a seemingly innocent encounter turned into a nightmare of cold-blooded murder. They trusted the wrong person, let their kindness override their instincts, and it cost them everything. When you're in an isolated place, far from help, trust your gut. If someone makes you feel uneasy, don't dismiss it. For Nina, the danger wasn't lurking in the woods, it was right beside her, in the form of people she once called friends. Sometimes the most horrifying thing isn't a stranger, but the ones we think we know. Bullying, groupthink, and peer pressure can spiral into something sinister. If you see something wrong, speak up, walk away, do something, because silence makes you complicit, and sometimes doing nothing is just as bad as doing harm. And then there's Ethan and his friends, who ventured into a part of the woods no one dared to go. They ignored the warnings, dismissed their fears, and assumed they were safe simply because they were together. But in the wild, numbers don't always mean safety. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an old man with a knowing smile, or the feeling of being watched when there's no one there. So what can you do? Always tell someone where you're going. The more isolated your trip, the more important it is to have a backup plan. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, whether it's a person, a place, or just an overwhelming sense of dread, don't ignore it. Stay together. There is safety in numbers, but only if you actually stick together. Never leave someone behind. Be prepared. Carry protection, whether it's a weapon, a GPS tracker, or even a loud whistle. It could make all the difference. Know when to leave. Sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is pack up and get out. Don't let curiosity or pride keep you in a dangerous situation. Horror stories aren't just for entertainment, they serve as reminders, warnings. The world isn't always what it seems, and neither are the people in it. To everyone who has stayed until the end, thank you. Whether you're listening in your car, at home, or lying awake in the dark, I appreciate every single one of you. If these stories gave you chills, if they made you think twice about that next camping trip, then my job here is done. This is Enigma of the Unknown, signing off. Stay safe, stay aware, and most of all, never ignore the feeling that someone might be watching you, because sometimes they are.